Hey everybody, good to see you all back again. Work continues on X231's 3-point lift system. I've worked my way through the cleaning of the valve block as well as the control quadrant. Lots of little pieces here, but trust me, it's actually pretty simple. Everything here pretty much only does one thing. But I know hydraulic systems can be a bit intimidating to those who are not familiar with them, and I can also tell by the analytics as of late, even the core X231 viewers have been fleeing from this hydraulic system with every episode. The last one I put out was the lowest viewed and the least well received of the last 10 uploads. So it's my job to try to make things relatable, understandable, hopefully enjoyable, watchable. We will see. So to do that, I think we're going to take a step back and just slow down a little bit. The last one involved a lot of disassembly of a lot of things that their function was not easily, it wasn't readily apparent. We'll put it that way. So what we're going to do today is just focus on what's on the green rag here on the bench, just the valve block and related items. We can let all this stuff just, stay over there. And I think this is going to be a fairly easy one to understand, even though there's ports and passages and plugs and things. And like I said, everything here pretty much only has one task. And once you just learn what that is, all of a sudden a light bulb comes on and hey, this is actually pretty simple. And I think we're going to accomplish that today. So let's dig on into it. Now, the first thing I need to talk about is the cleaning and the reconditioning. And of course, these valve blocks have a lot of nooks and crannies. They're like Swiss cheese, so it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience to get everything completely clean. I was able to do that, happy with how it turned out. And the last time I was having trouble getting these slide valves to start in and out of the spools. And this is how they're supposed to be, just a very nice, smooth slip fit. You can't even feel a click. It's such tight tolerance in order to get everything to seal. 4 10,000ths of an inch clearance is all we have for the slide valve inside the spool. And I chalked the difficulty I was having in getting these to start in just to them being dirty because it's such tight tolerances. What I ended up finding was someone, before I got to this, had used what looks like the rounded end of a ball peen hammer to hammer all these spools out of the block and put them back in again. I'm trying to find where we can get the light to reflect just right. Here we go, all through here. That's all hammer marks. All up through here, it's all hammer marks. And they even hammered on the ends of the spools. Look at all those old hammer marks in the end of that one. And anytime you put a mark in something with a hammer, you've moved metal. So when you have a slide valve that is that tight of a fit inside of a spool, if you move any metal at all, you've just created a problem for yourself. And this one would actually stick when it got to about there. They had mushroomed that down so far. So I had to very carefully, extremely carefully, hone these back out. And if I would have had to go down into the main travel area of the valve, this would have been destroyed. Fortunately, I was able to stick to the areas above the slide valve travel and just get it so it frees back up. And you got to start them in absolutely square. There we are. It's such a tight tolerance, but now excellent slide fit all the way through. So I had to do that to all 4 of those slide valves and spools. That took me the better part of one whole day just to renew those fits. So now that everything is clean and in good condition, we can begin simplifying matters some. First thing you'll notice is, wow, there's a lot of plug holes in this. It's actually a lot easier to understand than what you would think. We talked about the 4 that were on the bottom the last time, and I usually leave those because they've already kind of ground and hammered those for clearance reasons. But all the rest of these, well, you got these 4 big ones. Those are for your extra hydraulic cylinders, and you've got the remaining smaller ones. Those smaller ones are all just passages that they drilled through the block from all directions to join all of these spool bores to one another. That creates all the hydraulic circuits on the inside. And we don't need to worry about those, so we'll just seal those up with new 1/4-inch pipe plugs for now, just to get them off of our radar. So that takes care of the 2 on the side, and we have these other 2 on the top. There we go. So now we talk about the spool valves. We've got 4 of them. Each spool has its own bore inside the main block, like that. And each spool has 3 ports. Now the ports are the areas that have all these holes drilled all the way around. Okay, so we've got 3 ports in this one, 3 ports in that one, on down the line. They're all the same in that regard. And the raised polished areas on each side of the ports, that is the sealing surface for the O-rings that are inside the main block. Look on down that bore. We can see 1, 2, 3, 4 grooves all the way down. Each one is the same way. So rubber O-rings go in each one of those grooves in all 4 of those spool bores in the block. And those O-rings are what seal the individual ports off from one another. So we got an O-ring here, one there, and one there. So that's what seals all 3 of these ports from one another on the outside. The slide valves then are what seal the ports off from one another on the insides of the spools. I'm going to take this spool valve and set him off to the side. He's unique. These other 3 are identical in the way they function. So I'll pull the slide valve out of this spool so that you can get a view of what's happening. We have this raised polished area here and the other raised polished area down there. They look like miniature pistons that don't have any rings installed in the grooves. That is what does the actual sealing to the inside of the spool. And that's where that tight tolerance slip fit comes into play. So with this centered out, look through this porthole here and that porthole there. You can see we have sealing surface of valve inside each one. So in their neutral state, the only port that's open is the one in the center. That's the one that's getting fluid flow. They have these other 2 completely blocked off. Put the valve on the outside of the spool and you can see how those 2 sealing areas line up with those 2 end ports. So when you need to actuate this valve, you either pull it out or you push it in somewhat. So if you pulled it out, those sealing areas are going to surround the middle port and this rear one, and that allows the middle port to share its fluid supply over to the end one and then back out, so that you could neutral it back out. You've closed that center supply port off again, so there's nothing flowing out the spool. Now you push the valve forward. That basically shares fluid from the center port to this end one, all right? And then you neutral it back out. It seals both end ports off, and you just have fluid in the center once again. So that's what these spool valves do. Start that in very carefully. They just slide out a little bit, or they slide in a little bit, or they neutral out. And that just takes fluid from the middle to the one side, or from the middle to the other side, or just keeps it trapped in the middle altogether. Now this one on the end that I said was different, this is the master spool valve. And the sliding valve looks a little bit different, but it works the same way, only this one seals the inside of the spool in 4 different places. And when it centers out, it's in about this position right here. So it allows fluid flow through the rear port at all times. And in the neutral position, it allows fluid to come in the front port, and it shares it with the middle. And this slide valve only moves about that far, okay? And when it moves, it still allows fluid to go through the rear port, but it blocks the fluid from the front port to the middle. So that's all the master valve does, just from about right there to right there, okay? So that's pretty easy to understand. Now we'll talk about how the master spool works in conjunction with the other 3. Now the valve block needs a fluid supply, and that comes in through this bottom hole down here. And we already talked about what feeds that when we put the 3-point housing together. It's this pressure tube that runs up front from the hydraulic pump on the back of the tractor. So the pump sends all of its fluid through this tube, and the O-ring and ferrule on the end of the tube is what goes in that hole at the bottom of the block. So the center opening here is where the master spool lives, and our supply is coming in through this bottom passage here. That bottom passage goes most of the way through the valve block and has 2 other passages that feed up into the master spool bore. And with a little bit of backlighting, you can see the one at the front and the one at the back. So that's what sets the master spool apart from the rest. It gets fluid supply to the rear port and to the front. And I can already hear you all drifting away because boring. So I dusted off the crayons and I created a hydraulic circuit flow guide. This is going to make it a lot easier to understand. So for the most part, the piece of paper itself is our block, okay? And we just need to put everything next to its representation. So here's our master spool here. So there's the master. We have auxiliary spool 1, which would be this guy, okay? And then we have auxiliary spool 2, which is this one. And then we have the lift spool up top, which is this one. And we have RFV, stands for reverse flow valve. That's this guy right here. So he goes by RFV, all right. Up here we have the relief. So this was our relief valve. We pulled the sleeve out in the last episode, but there's the poppet and the spring. So for all intents and purposes, that's our relief right there. So you're starting to see the similarities here. We have all of our components plus the piece of paper is our block, and it's going to make it a lot easier to understand how everything works together. So we'll start down here at the bottom with the hydraulic pump. It draws fluid from the reservoir housing and outputs it through that pressure tube into the bottom of the main valve block. And the way the line splits and goes in two directions represents how the block takes that incoming fluid and directs it to the front port and the rear port of the master spool at the same time. So here's our master spool in the diagram, and these blue lines represent the contact areas of the slide valve inside of the spool. And this is exactly how it would be in the neutral position. So we've got this wide space here bridging the front port to the middle. This narrow space back here isolates the rear port from the front too. So the fluid comes from the pump and it goes up into the front port, and then it can go back and out the middle port of that master spool, at what point it goes back into the valve block and it makes its way to the oil filter. So flipping our block around, this is where the fluid exits to the filter through this hole right here. That lines up with this opening in the filter housing. That opening feeds the center area down here where that fluid is directed into the middle of the fluid filter. It then gets pushed through the filter and accumulates in this outer area here. Once it builds up to the point that it can run back through this opening here, it finds this passage on the side, which lines up with this passage in the side of the block and acts as a return flow avenue for it to go back into the main reservoir housing. So that's what you see here. Pump through the master spool, through the filter, back to the reservoir. So then what's happening with the fluid that's going through this other end port of the master spool? Well, fluid is present, but it's stagnant, as indicated by the X's. Nothing is flowing on this side. So fluid goes through the master spool up to the reverse flow valve. And if we overlay our pointed stopper with spring over the diagram, you start to recognize what's what with that. So yeah, that stopper only opens when there is active fluid flow. Because there's no fluid flow, it's closed against the seat. So it's basically holding everything hostage that's up above it. It's not letting any of that run back down through the master spool. So we have fluid present behind the RFV and going up through the center port of both the aux1 and aux2 spools, as well as the lift spool. They only get pressure supply or fluid supply on their center ports, okay? And it also is present in the line out to the lift piston, but there's nothing moving, so the piston stays down. And we also have fluid present up to the relief valve right there. But the reason why we only have fluid actually circulating on the filter side is because it takes a lot less pressure to push fluid through a filter than it does to overcome that relief valve. So everything up here just stalls out. In the neutral position, all of your pump output is just being filtered, continuous loop. So now we've got a fresh diagram. This shows what happens when we try to make any leg of the hydraulic system work. So it doesn't matter which one of the three control levers you move, it is going to move the master spool plus whichever auxiliary spool that lever happens to be attached to. In this scenario, we're looking at auxiliary spool 1. Auxiliary, sorry. So aux1 spool and aux2 spools live in these two spool bores there and there, and they direct fluid through these large ports that are on the side. So we'll say aux1 lives down here and it's going to run fluid through both of those ports. And these ports are where you would attach lines that go out to an extra hydraulic cylinder. Maybe it's on a front end loader, maybe it's on a wood splitter, anything that has a two-way cylinder that needs to move. So when you move the lever, if everything is properly adjusted, the master spool will move along with the auxiliary spool that the lever is attached to, and they have to be synchronized so that they both move at the same time. We'll look at the master spool down here first. So it used to be here, neutraled out, but now it's moved forward like that. So we are now blocking any output from that center port that used to go to the filter. So at this point, fluid is coming into that front port and it's trapped. It can't move. So the pump is directing all of its fluid flow now on out to the work. So we still have this back port is sealed off from the front one, so fluid can flow through that and up to our reverse flow valve. And because fluid is flowing under pressure, you can see we've compressed the spring and we've moved the stopper off of its seat so we can bypass fluid around that stopper. The fluid then goes up into the center feed port of our X1 spool, and because we have went from the sealed off position to this position right here, the fluid can go in the center and forward to that front port. It can then exit the spool and exit the block and go to the cylinder. So in this scenario, we have fluid under pressure coming out this front port, heading on out to the cylinder. And anytime we put pressure to one side of a piston in a two-way cylinder, it has to purge that same amount of fluid out from the other side of the cylinder. So we have some return flow coming from the cylinder back into the block through this opening right here. That block then will feed into the back port of X1, and it can come in that port, but it can't go forward because our slide valve is sealing it off. But it can exit out the back center hole around the valve stem. So all of our return flow is coming back in and basically into that rear port, out the back, and because this entire three-point lift assembly is basically one big fluid reservoir, it will just run around and find its way back down to the bottom of the reservoir where the pump can pick it up again and send it back out on its way. So say we want to move that hydraulic cylinder back the other way. The same steps happen, just the fluid flow is reversed. So our master spool will once again close off that center port so we're not feeding the filter. And this time we will take X1 valve and pull it back. So now we are taking pressure from that center port and putting it to the rear port, as you can see right here. So now where the fluid used to be coming in, the fluid is now being pushed out. So where fluid used to be pushed out, the return flow is coming back in. So our return flow finds that front port on X1 and it's able to run right out the front opening of the spool and once again finds its way back down to the reservoir where the pump can pick it up once again. And X2 works just like X1. So all these steps could apply up here just as well as they apply right here. So now say we want to raise our three-point lift arms, and remember, they're connected to the piston. When the piston travels back, the arms raise, all right? So we're not messing with X1 lever or X2 lever. We are on the outside lever, the main lift. So when we move that lever, we need to have the master spool valve and the lift spool valve synchronized and moving at the same time. That's critically important. So our master spool valve has done the same thing that it always does. It blocks that center port so that we are not filtering anything and the pump is sending its full fluid supply past the reverse flow valve and up through the center ports of both X1 and X2 where it makes its way up to the center port of our lift spool. And as you can see from our position here, we have joined the center port with that front port so fluid can then go under pressure out this front port and into the block and then out through this tube right here. And that's the opening that tube goes in on the block. And the other end of this tube feeds the front of the hydraulic piston cylinder. So that's how you get fluid pressure out into your cylinder. And you can see it's filled up with fluid and it's pushing the piston back. And as the piston pushes back, that's what makes the lift arms raise. Now, what happens when you want to let the lift arms back down? Well, we have a fresh diagram for that, and this is where the master spool valve does something that you would not expect. So you take your outer main lift lever and you run that thing all the way down. Lift arms are coming down. What that does is it pulls your lift spool valve back like that, and what you've done is basically cut your fluid pressure off to this port that feeds the cylinder. And this back port on your lift spool has no passages to feed anything to in the main valve block. So this is basically deadheaded right here. There's no place for anything to go. So at the same time then, your master spool valve is allowed to center out to the neutral position. So that opens this front port back up to the center port, and now all the pump's output is being routed back through the fluid filter, and the fluid is loving life at this point. It's like a trip to the spa. It's being cleaned and refreshed, and the work's all done. So because we have cut the fluid flow up here, our reverse flow valve goes back against its seat. So it's holding all of this hostage up here, not letting anything drain back. And because you've also cut fluid pressure to your hydraulic piston cylinder, just the weight of the lift arms and the implement and everything is pushing the piston back down the cylinder. That's pushing the fluid out through that tube, back into the block, into this front port of the lift spool, and right on out the open end. And it can just then run back through the 3-point lift assembly, back to the reservoir, and the pump can pick it up, send it on through the filter. All right, and final diagram now. The one thing we haven't talked about is the pressure relief valve up here. So, say you're trying to run the hydraulic system, but something is not movable. That means you're going to have your master spool valve cutting flow to the filter. That's normal. Pump's trying to put all of its output to the work. But it doesn't matter if your aux1 can't move or your aux2 can't move, or maybe you've got too much weight on the lift arms, so your lift spool is trying but nothing's happening. Well, the pump is pushing fluid and we're getting past our reverse flow valve, but it's all squiggly up here because it's angry. It's mad, pressure's building up, it can't go anywhere, and finally it says, I'm busting out anywhere I can go. Finally, pressure builds up to the point that it compresses the spring behind the relief valve. That moves out of its seat, and then that finally lets that excess pressure run back through the whole 3-point lift assembly back down to the reservoir. And hopefully by that point the operator has detected something is wrong, and he takes his hand off the lever and lets everything neutral back out, and the whole process stops. So that's a pretty good rundown of all the different operating phases of this valve block and these valves. So now we just put it together. So picking up where we left off with the last diagram, we'll start with the pressure relief valve. Now this is the one where I said last time it's probably best to leave the seat or the sleeve inside the block, but I pulled it out anyway. We'll reinstall this, and I do have the depth mic handy. These are installed at a just about 1-inch depth from the top of the sleeve to the top surface of the block here, and it goes down inside that bore right there. So the shiny end is the one that was pressed in before, and we've got a little bit of a, get in frame dude, a little bit of a 45-degree chamfer on the end, so that helps it to start in. And I'll just try to center it up with the punch, and we will tap it in. And I mentioned these are at about a 1-inch depth. I had an actual measurement of 0.997 before I took it out. We're at 0.996 right now. We'll call that close enough. And I just need to test fit the actual poppet in the sleeve. Yes, very good fit, good slide. So we know the sleeve survived just fine. Now, when I took this apart, there's supposed to be adjustment shims between the spring and the relief poppet, and I found none in this block. So I checked the block from my parts lift. There were no shims in that one either. So I'm just going to put it together like this with no shims. X231 is never going to have to really lift anything very heavy anyway. But your relief valve setting needs to be, it needs to pop from 1200 to 1300 psi. And if you had shims beneath the spring, the shims would be 25 thousandths thick each, and the manual states that every additional 25 thousandths thick shim beneath the spring raises your pop-off pressure by about 40 psi. So just so you have all that data handy. For now, I'm going to leave the poppet and spring out because we need to flip the block over and work on this side next. Next up now is the reverse flow valve. You recognize him from the diagram. It goes in this hole, that opening right there. And if you look down the bottom, you can see the seat that our tapered stopper comes to rest against, but we need to renew the O-ring down here on the end. The Minneapolis Moline part number is at 10A8025. But if we go back to our regular O-ring kit, this is a dash number 111, standard O-ring. New O-ring in place. To avoid having the stopper fall out of the housing, I'll just tip it on its side. Throw it in like that. And the O-ring should hold the housing in. Yep, just fine. Won't fall out. Now, to begin sealing all of the spool bores. We've got 4 spool bores, and each one takes 4 O-rings. So that's 16 total, and we can pull them out of our O-ring selection kit. The Minneapolis Moline number for those is 10A7850, but they're just a standard dash number 218 size O-ring. Skipping right to the end, here's number 15. Get down in that groove. All right, and number 16, last one. Get him down in there. Okay, good. Clean our mess. Oh, here's a little bit of backlighting. Give you a view. Nice new rings in all the bores. And with our before picture from disassembly as a roadmap and our non-ball peen hammer, we're ready to start throwing the spools in. Master spool is the easy one. It goes right in the center. And the rear of the spool is facing me right now with the rear face of the block. So just to keep all of that straight, I just use the return port as auxiliary spool holder, so I know how to position this. And fresh coating of ATF on all the O-ring sealing surfaces, and we can start it in. Sometimes you can push them in by hand. Yeah, this one's going pretty easy. Yep, I don't think I really need the hammer, but they're giving you a little bit of help. Doesn't hurt. There. Through all 4 rings. Now I can take the valve. Make sure we got good oil coverage on all the contact surfaces. And there we are. That's the first one. 3 more to go. Next up is the lift spool. Down in this corner. Aux1 spool. And Aux2. So we can tip it up now, get all of our levers and spools under control, get them settled out where they need to be. Those 2 are good there, bell crank's good there. So we have really not that much left to do. We can finally go back to the relief poppet, and we'll get a little bit of oil on there. Always good. Throw him into his sleeve, get him home. That's good there. Spring can go in on top, and we finish up then with our 3/8 pipe plug cylinder takeout plugs, and this is all that X231 is probably going to have, because I'm never going to put lines in here to run any remote cylinders. So we get the bottom 2, and I'll throw some thread sealer on these and tighten them in permanently. Oh, come on. This is live, folks. Tighten them in permanently after we turn the camera off. but just to represent what is happening here. We've got every opening sealed now. We've got all the spools and spool valves in. Our reverse flow valve is in. Our relief valve and spring is in, and everything's looking good. So if I can get these boys to behave here, there we are, nice tidy package. So now hopefully you understand everything there is to know about the operation of the valve block. Pretty simple. You move a spool one direction, fluid flows one way. You move it the other direction, fluid flows the other way, and your master valve just decides if we're sending all of our fluid to the filter or if we're sending it all to the work. So now that I've made a mess of things again, here we are. I think we've got an episode. Okay, so that's pretty much the brain of the system. Next we go to the control quadrant. So that's command central. And once again, it looks like there's a lot of parts and pieces here, but everything here only does one thing. And when you really get in it and break it down, you'll see that it's not that complicated at all. So hopefully this was entertaining as much as it was informative, and I hope this episode is a little more well received than the last couple hydraulic ones. I'm even losing the hardcore X231 viewers with this stuff, but the same scenario kind of happened when I was doing the Farm All H and I got into the electrical portion. When it moves into kind of the more abstract and you don't really see levers, cogs, pistons, and gears, a lot of people just kind of get overwhelmed and wander off. So I'm kind of like that myself with some things, so I think I understand. All right, everyone, I think I'll let you all go right here. Thank you as always. Hope to see you back on the next one.